Coming in at number 10, we have Japan's Unit 731. Today we look at Japan as the land of anime and Hello Kitty. They seem like such a nice, polite group of people that never want to do any harm to anyone. But remember, before they were the land of samurai and warfare, and during World War II they were aligned with the Nazis. The PR campaign that went on over there was amazing. And during World War II there was one of the most horrific units ever, which was known as Unit 731. They performed some of the most brutal experiments on people known to man. They were mostly performed on Chinese people, as they would invade Chinese villages while they destroyed and murdered everyone. They would take fleas that were infected with horrible diseases and they would let them loose on people. They would go in and infect people with cholera and other horrible diseases to see how they would spread. They wanted to test how much pressure the human body could take, so they would take Chinese prisoners and they would put them into a pressurized tank, and they would keep increasing the pressure until their eyes exploded in their head. And that is just some of the horrible things that happened. Coming in at number 9, we have Bringing Back the Dead. Now, this next experiment wasn't performed on humans, but at the end they said it would work on humans, which is absolutely insane. There was a study done in California that wanted to see if you could take a dead organ and implant it into a person and have that person live. This should be impossible because once an organ is dead, the cells will no longer function. Well, turns out that's not true. They were able to successfully transfer a dead heart into a baboon, and the baboon could use it to survive. However, it did later die, but this was the early stages of the testing, and as I said before, they were confident that they could eventually use this on humans. I guess you could get a big discount on a heart if it's been dead for a little while. Coming in at number 8, we have the monster study. I see why people don't trust people. When you let someone in, like someone you're supposed to trust, like a doctor or a scientist, and then they use this as an opportunity to ruin your life. In 1939, a professor at the University of Iowa had a theory that there was a link between confidence and stuttering, that kids with anxiety stutter because they are too afraid to talk. So to prove his theory, he went to an orphanage and indoctrinated kids with the idea that they would stutter in the future. He was trying to make them stutter. So guess what happened? They never started stuttering, but they became too afraid to talk. Coming in at number 7, we have electroshock therapy on kids. I am very happy I grew up in a home where my parents treated my behavioral problems with yelling and not experimental treatments. This all comes from Dr. Loretta Bender, who was a psychotherapist in the 60s and thought that she could cure future mental disorders through electrocuting the brain. And it didn't really seem like there was anyone too young to be diagnosed as a possible victim of psychosis, as the youngest person she ever experimented on was 3 years old. Eventually her whole project was shut down. Coming in at number 6, we have MK Ultra. This is one of the most famous experiments for several reasons. One, the CIA was involved. They funded, documented, and participated in almost everything associated with the test. There were some people who think that Charles Manson was one of the test subjects, and on top of all of this, conspiracy theory people love this one. For those of you who don't know, MK Ultra was when the American government went deep into trying to find a way to perform mind control on people. They did this through many means. Sometimes they would put people in isolation for extended periods of time. They would also see how hypnosis affects the brain, and the most popular part about this is they would use LSD to see how much it would affect people and if their minds could be controlled with the drug. One thing they would do is have prostitutes that were actually CIA agents dose Johns and then watch what would happen to them. That's a night you won't soon forget. And bringing it back to the Charles Manson conspiracy, some people think that they used LSD on him while he was in prison because they would also take prisoners for these experiments and not tell them what was happening. And through this, some people think Charles Manson learned how to influence people through LSD and later used this to build his cult. Coming in at number 5, we have Project Artichoke. Turns out the CIA tried to master mind control more than once. While MK Ultra was more of a test to control the mind surrounding LSD and seeing if they could control a person to divulge secret information, Project Artichoke was seeing if they could control a person's mind and make them do their bidding. Basically, if you can make them a robot and send them out into the world to do whatever you wanted. None of these test subjects knew they were being experimented on, and some of the attempts at controlling a person came through getting them addicted to morphine and seeing how far they would go to get a fix. Coming in at number 4, we have the Stanford Prison Experiment. This study was done to see if human beings naturally gravitate towards being evil if given the opportunity. It was run by Philip Zimbardo, and it took place in a fake prison where students volunteered to be both prisoners and prison guards. This would mimic a real prison scenario. At first glance, it would seem that humans have a tendency to treat each other horribly and will abuse power, as the prison guards started treating the prisoners horribly even though they knew they were fellow students. They would go out of their way to humiliate them, and many prisoners started to show signs of mental breakdown. The experiment was cut short because the violence increased to such a level that the safety of the students was at risk. So are people naturally monsters? Well, it wouldn't seem so. It was later revealed that Zimbardo told the students playing the guards that they should treat the prisoners poorly and encourage their malicious behavior. So the study wasn't conducted on fair grounds and is now viewed as something extremely unethical. Coming in at number 3, we have the Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Test. Here's something I'm learning from this list. If you're in prison and they ever offer you to do some testing, say no, because who knows what's going to happen to you, and it seems that the people testing you see you as expendable. I think I'll just serve out my sentence without being exposed to some sort of horrible disease or experimental drug. Well, the Stateville Malaria Test was put in place to help out the war effort in World War II. There was a huge problem with malaria, so the Americans wanted to come up with a vaccine. They did this by offering prisoners the opportunity to be part of some testing. Mind you, the people involved were willful applicants, but I don't think they knew the severity of what they were getting themselves into. Coming in at number 2, we have the Tuskegee study. When you hear about stuff like this, it makes perfect sense why people don't trust the government or government officials. In the year 1932, the Tuskegee study was started and saw almost 400 black men in Alabama infected with syphilis without them knowing. The purpose of the study was to see the long-term effects of syphilis, which range from syphilis infecting your eyes and causing you to go blind. It can go into your spine and cause your spinal column to decay, and it can also go into your brain and cause you to go insane, as well as a ton of other horrible effects. This was a government-funded experiment, and all of the subjects were black men. They were told that they were being treated for bad blood. One of the most horrible aspects of this study was that it went on for 40 years, well after the cure for syphilis was discovered. Coming in at the number 1 spot, we have the twin studies. One of the most horrific parts of the Second World War were the experiments performed by Joseph Mengele in the concentration camps. Mengele is one of the most infamous people of the war, and for good reason. He was a heartless monster who did horrible things to people that can never be forgiven. For some reason, his main focus was on twins. He had twins brought to him from all over Europe, and in total he would perform experiments on about 1,500 sets of twins. He would do things like sew them together. He would remove limbs from one twin to see if the other twin could feel the missing limb, and on more than one occasion he would inject chloroform into the hearts of the twins to see if they would live.
Starting us off at number 10 is the sex reassignment trial. Psychologist and sexual behavior expert Dr. John William Money fully believed that gender was something that was learned rather than something that was innate and that you were born with. In 1965, David Peter Reimer was born biologically a male, meaning he had a penis. At 7 months old, he underwent his circumcision that was weirdly done via cauterization. The doctor messed up and his penis was accidentally destroyed, and this is where Dr. Money stepped in and convinced David's parents that he would be able to successfully sexually mature if they raised him as a girl. Money made David his own little experiment, and despite reporting continued success, David's perspective was vastly different. David shared he never identified as a female and was constantly teased by everyone growing up. By the time he was 13, he told his parents he was experiencing suicidal depression and would commit suicide if they ever made him meet Dr. Money again. That's when the parents came clean about the sex reassignment, and David decided to live as a male at 14 years old onwards. Sadly, he committed suicide at the age of 38. And just to be clear, I hate how this doctor made David's whole life his own science experiment. That's ridiculous. And just to be clear, I personally support the trans community. I fully believe you can be born biologically female or male, but identify as something else. Live your truth, people. Live your truth. Coming in at number 9, we have Adam and Eve. Now this one was really interesting to read about, so hopefully you guys will like it too. And if you don't, well, sucks to suck because I like it. Ha ha ha. So if we go back to medieval Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II carried out what he called experiments, but were actually barbaric acts of torture. His sidekick was this ruthless Italian monk who wasn't gonna sit there and be like, oh Fred, maybe you shouldn't do that. He was like, yes, do it. Now the Emperor's infinite quest in life was discovering the language of God, and to do that he decided to experiment on 2 infants by keeping them from interacting with any human since the day they were born. Frederick thought without any human interaction interaction, they would learn the language of Adam and Eve, but as you could probably guess, it was an epic fail. The duo acted like complete savages, could not communicate at all, and eventually died in animal cage-like conditions. At number 8 we have mind control, and this one was wild. So back in the 60s, a Yale University professor by the name of Jose Delgado was hell-bent on finding a way to control the human mind and its actions, and therefore turn society into some sort of psycho-civilization. And I'm so glad he failed. Like, this guy sounds like one of those I'm gonna take over the world types, and we don't have time for that. Now, he invented the stim receiver that was essentially a radio that could apparently control the mind after being inserted into the brain. Jose first tested it on a raging bull and managed to successfully stop it, so people deemed the device a success. The stim receiver could stimulate your emotions and control physical reactions. He then planted it into a woman's brain that caused her to lose her motor skills and be very erotically stimulated. She even developed ulcers on her fingers from how often she'd adjust the amplitude dial of the device. Like, what is this experiment? It legit sounds like an episode of Black Mirror come to life, but way before its time. Can you imagine if this really succeeded exactly how Jose would have wanted? Like, what would this world be like right now? I'd have a chip implant in my brain. Filling on number 7 slot is Radioactivity Part 1. During the years 1963 and 1973, the US government was very interested in the effects of radiation with the Cold War and their rivalry with the Soviet Union, etc. So partnering up with the University of Washington, the university conducted an experiment wherein they got 130 inmates in Washington and Oregon prisons to voluntarily subject themselves to radiation in the testicles. In most of the cases, the person was zapped with over 400 rads of radiation in the testes, which is the equivalent of 2,400 chest x-rays. And of course, the men were never told how dangerous volunteering actually was. In 2000, the former participants thankfully sued and got a $2.4 million settlement from the university, but what the F? I feel like most of the inmates, if not all of them, definitely contracted testicular cancer. Like, how is that okay? 400 rads? Like, I don't even know what to say. I don't know what to say. Inmates are humans too. We all make mistakes. Unless you're like a pedophile rapist, then I hate you. Now, at number 6 is the sand flea. Now, the sand flea, also known as the chigger flea, is disgusting, but then aren't all fleas. They burrow themselves inside a warm-blooded host, for example, a human, and inside us it swells, it shits, and then lays eggs before dying a month or so later. Either way, Marlene Telecki, a PhD student from Berlin, was studying in Madagascar, and part of her job was to evaluate and record the developmental stages of sand fleas. Well, turns out she thought the best way to do her research was to let a sand flea live inside her own foot for 2 months. And mind you, one flea inside you automatically attracts others to you as well, so like, I don't know what this woman was thinking. Either way, she started intimately observing her foot, and the flea didn't really bother her. I don't understand, like, even this is like cringing me out. It was growing normally but wasn't laying eggs, which was odd for a mature sand flea. Marlene then realized, wait a minute, it's still alive, it's been 2 months, it should have been dead by now, and it still hasn't had kids. Turns out, this sand flea was a virgin and was stuck in the waiting stage of thinking a male was gonna come and fertilize it. Either way, that experiment was a low-key fail, but who willingly hosts a flea inside their foot, dude? Like, come on, I can't. Coming in at number 5 is the pneumonia torture experiment. Dr. Walter Jones, a physician from Petersburg, Virginia, was worried about the typhoid pneumonia outbreak that was occurring during the 1840s. Now, to try and cure the disease, he conducted an experiment using many 15 to 30-year-old male African slaves that were working on plantations in Virginia. His method was pouring boiling water on them. Like, I don't know what the science behind that was. Maybe he thought it would kill all the germs and bacteria. I really don't know. He did this to subjects who had symptoms like a high fever, nausea, diarrhea, sore throats, etc. A witness said that Jones once poured 5 gallons of boiling water on the back of one 25-year-old subject. Now, he claimed the experiment was a success and that it cured many subjects, but that was A, never verified, B, false, C, racist, and D, all levels of unethical. Need I say more? There needs to be no E. I've said it all. At number 4 is Radioactivity Part 2. You guys are probably wondering, why is Part 2 not after Part 1? Haha, plot twist, it's now. Now again, set your minds back to post-World War II, Cold War, international climate, the arms race is going, communism versus capitalism is full speed ahead, and the American side is heavily focusing on radiation and possibilities of chemical warfare. In an experiment undertaken at Vanderbilt University, 829 pregnant women were told that if they drank these specific vitamin drinks daily, it would improve not only their own health, but the health of their unborn children too. This vitamin drink was not a vitamin drink. Plot twist, it was actually filled filled with radioactive iron because the researchers were testing how quickly the radioisotope entered into the placenta. Radioactivity and babies? That's never a good mix. At least 7 of the babies died after birth due to leukemia or different forms of cancer. The women themselves experienced extreme hair and tooth loss, anemia, rashes, bruises, and of course, cancer. Filling our number 3 slot is the Aversion Project. I hate everything about this one, just absolutely everything. So during South Africa's disgusting apartheid period, the year was 1969, and it wasn't only black people they didn't like, it was homosexuals as well. So thousands and thousands of men were given to Dr. Aubrey Levin, a former army colonel and psychologist. Now Aubrey was convinced he could cure homosexuality using electroconvulsive aversion therapy to reorientate them to liking women. The electrodes were strapped to the subject's arm, and it was obviously connected to a dial going from 1 to 10. The experiment involved Aubrey showing the men pictures of naked men and asking them to fantasize about these pictures, and as soon as they started to do so, they would be given severe shocks. The experiment was a complete show. It was cruel, it was against human rights, it didn't work, and as soon as he learned he would be named a human rights abuser, he fled to Canada, and he's literally still here working at a teaching hospital. Like, this man should not be allowed to teach anyone. You can't shock someone into liking the other gender, that doesn't work. Aubrey. Now at number 2 is the Hoffling Hospital Experiment. Back in 1969, psychiatrist Charles K. Hoffling decided to conduct a field experiment testing levels of obedience to authority figures, and in this case between a nurse and a doctor. It involved 22 nurses getting a call from a doctor saying the nurse had to administer 20 milligrams of a fictitious drug called Astrotin to a patient and that the doctor would later sign for it. Now Astrotin is not on the approved drug list, and on the bottle it said 10 milligrams was the maximum daily dosage. And keep in mind the doctor told them to administer 20 milligrams. Hoffling then asked 21 nursing students and 12 nurses whether the nurses in the experiment would obey the doctor, suppress their own judgment and administer the lethal dose, or would they not. Out of them, 10 nurses and all the students said they would not do it, but in the experiment, 21 out of 22 nurses actually did it, and in real life, that would have killed the patient. And this blew my mind. The nurses in the experiment were also given a questionnaire, and all of them stated they would not obey the orders of the doctor, yet 21 out of 22 did. I feel like that really goes to show how weirdly our minds are wired and how authority is so overarching. 21 of you out here killing patients because you think Dr. What's-His-Face knows better than you do. And finally, at number 1 is the mustard gas experiment. The year is 1943, we are close to the end of World War II, and the Navy has had enough. They were testing the effectiveness of new gas masks and clothing against things like deadly gas, which had been such a huge blow to them in World War I. They were like, fool us once, shame on you. Fool us twice, shame on us. We aren't playing again. Mustard gas, not today. So in one of the worst experiments ever undertaken by the Naval Research Lab, they went and asked a bunch of 17 and 18-year-old boys who had just completed 8 weeks of boot camp if they wanted to volunteer for an experiment that would shorten the war. And in that scenario, who's gonna say no? It was only when they got to the lab did they realize the experiment involved mustard gas. Now all participants suffered severe internal and external burns, and all that was completely brushed off by the Navy. The Navy even threatened them with the Espionage Act if they tried to take action against them.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the Pit of Despair. This experiment was conducted by Henry Harlow and is one of the most controversial on this list. In a sort of mental health study, Henry decided to induce depression in monkeys. He took very young monkeys and separated them from their peers and mothers and put them into isolation in a cage that was called the Pit of Despair. Sometimes the monkeys would stay there for longer, more extended periods, and other times they would be repeatedly separated and put into the cage for multiple shorter stays. These monkeys all proved to be extremely psychologically disturbed after the conclusion of this experiment, which should have seemed kind of obvious even before the experiment was even conducted. These monkeys were used as a model of human clinical depression, but here's where things got even sadder than they already were. These monkeys were unable to be treated and rehabilitated. Despite various forms of treatment, they just were unable to get back to the place they would have been had they not been subject to this cruel experiment. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit that thumbs up button. It really helps us out. In our number 9 spot today, we have cell regeneration. This experiment experiment comes to us from 2009 from the University of Pittsburgh's McGowan's Institute of Regenerative Medicine. This experiment, which proved successful, was aimed to find a way to regenerate human cells, especially in the hopes of one day being able to regrow human limbs. Obviously an interesting topic with an important and exciting goal, but the way they went about this was definitely quite shocking. Basically, scientists took a pig's bladder and scraped out some cells from the inside of the lining. They then took these tissues and decellularized them, which is the process that is used in order to isolate the extracellular matrix. After this, they are dried and then used. By this method, scientists were able to actually regrow a finger, which is pretty unbelievable. There is something kind of insane about a dried pig bladder being able to regrow an organ, but science is pretty wild a lot of the time. In our number 8 spot today, we have vampire rats. Whether you believe in vampires or not, this experiment might have proven that they really might be onto something. It is possible that maybe the blood of the young can make you reverse in age and live forever. Well, maybe not literally. Scientists conducted an experiment in which they joined 2 mice together. One of the mice was young and one of the mice was older. They connected their circulatory systems in order to study the effects and basically just to see if anything would happen. Once the circulatory systems were connected and the older mouse was receiving the blood of the younger mouse, the older one began to experience reversing in the aging of both the muscles and the brain. This is obviously extremely interesting, exciting, and potentially promising, but there is much more research and time that needs to go into this particular study before it can even begin to think about reaching a human trial phase. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Robo-Rat. As it turns out, our phones sometimes are not enough to keep full tracking tabs on us, so it looks like people are trying to create even more creepy, sneaky ways to spy on, well, anyone. Researchers have found a way to have remote-controlled animals that can help them keep an eye on you. Cybernetic rats and beetles have both already been created and have proven to be quite effective, which is already quite disgusting and a little strange, but now researchers are wanting to take it even a step further. Next up is flying bugs. Imagine that fly buzzing around your bedroom and keeping you up at night is actually being controlled by someone who's trying to keep an eye on you. This one could definitely be the plot to a horror movie. Maybe it already is. In our number 6 spot today, we have the undead. If you've seen The Walking Dead or really any zombie anything, you'll wonder why anyone was ever conducting this experiment at all. And if you're a sensitive animal lover, you might want to skip over this number. A team of Russian scientists released a video in which they showed a few dog heads that were being kept alive by an artificial blood circulation system. In the video, the scientists used a heart-lung machine and were able to show the dog's head responding to sound. They would wiggle their ears, blink their eyes, and sometimes were even able to lick their mouths. In 2005, for some reason, American scientists began to try to recreate this horrifying experience. They flushed out all of the blood from a dog and replaced it with oxygen and sugar saline. Just 3 hours after this, and after a blood transfusion and an electric shock, the dog was somehow brought back from the dead. I truly wish I knew the purpose of this experiment, but I think I mostly wish it just never occurred at all. In our number 5 spot today, we have britches. Britches is a perfect example of a horrifying experiment done on an animal for human gain. Basically, researchers wanted to test out brain-implanted sonar devices in an attempt to create something that would be an asset to people without sight. There have been people without sight in the past, and I'm sure also in the present, who have been able to develop a sort of echolocation type skill where by clicking their tongue or making other sounds, they're able to map out their surroundings. Such a cool thing, and having a scientific advancement or the technology to help with this process should be an amazing thing, and it definitely is, until the experiment takes a very dark turn. This is where Britches comes in. Britches was a monkey who did have his sight, but in order to test the efficacy of this device, they needed a monkey without sight. Instead of finding a monkey without sight, they just took Britches away, and they did this by sewing his perfectly healthy eyes shut. This experiment was undoubtedly helpful in the scientific process, but it should never be at this kind of a cost. It is pretty clear that Britches most definitely did not deserve that kind of treatment at all. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Hoffling Hospital experiment. This experiment happened all the way back in 1966 in a time where the rules of psychological experiments were a lot more loosey-goosey. Because of this, the nurses that were all a part of this experiment had no idea that they were participants, which nowadays would be illegal. Basically, this experiment took place on the night shift. The night nurse would receive a phone call during the shift, and on the other end would be Dr. Smith, who's actually the researcher. He would ask the nurses to check check the medicine cabinet to see if they had a drug called astrotin. This was actually a drug that was made up for this experiment, and it was just a placebo. The astrotin would clearly state that the maximum dosage was 10 milligrams, but Dr. Smith would ask the nurses to administer 20 milligrams. They were told that the doctor was in a hurry and he would sign the authorization papers as soon as he came to see the patient later on that night. If the nurse decided to give the patient the drug, they would be breaking 3 rules. They're not allowed to accept instructions over the phone, the dose was double the maximum limit stated on the box, and the medicine itself was unauthorized and it wasn't on the ward stock list, so it shouldn't be in use at the hospital. Out of the 22 unknowing nurse participants, 21 of them went to administer this drug. That's insane. This wasn't to say that nurses were bad people or bad at their job, but this experiment combined with the interviews that happened afterwards showed how the power imbalance and the social pressure that comes along with that can affect the outcome of a workplace extremely drastically, and in this case it really could have been a matter of life and death. In our number 3 spot today we have THN1412. In 2007 there began the trial of a newer drug called THN1412 that was intended to be used to treat leukemia. It is normal for a drug to have gone through an animal testing phase prior to being tested on humans, and this one was no different. This drug had been only tested in animals prior to this, but the animal trials were very successful, so it was dubbed safe to begin testing in human trials. To start off with, the humans were given a dose that was 500 times lower than the dose that was given to the animals, just to play things as safe as possible. Unfortunately, however, these precautions did not seem to be enough, as this drug that had undergone all the necessary pretrial steps ended up being catastrophic once humans became involved. This drug began to cause organ failure in those who had even a tiny dose of it. I'm not sure if there would have been a way to know this prior to this terrible event, or if this is just one of those terrible caveats to the trial testing process. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. In the years between 1932 and 1972, there were 399 black impoverished farmers in Alabama who all had syphilis, who were recruited to participate in a free program. They were told that the program would help them treat their ailment, but of course that never happened. The experiment was conducted by people who were trying to see what would happen if the disease went untreated. Instead of treating the men with penicillin, which was the recommended treatment at the time, the men received aspirin and mineral supplements as placebos. And while this experiment was conducted to try and understand what effect the spread of disease has on the body, the unethical considerations of the scientists who conducted it proved to be absolutely fatal and just downright cruel. Out of the 399, 28 of them passed away from the disease directly, 100 of them passed away from complications related to the disease, 40 spouses became infected, which then led to 19 children being passed the disease at birth. This whole situation truly is one of those times where you stop and wonder how these things were ever treated as acceptable, and really hope that things have changed for good. In our number 1 spot today, we have Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 713 conducted some pretty horrifying experiments during World War II that certainly are shocking to anyone who learns about them. The experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was gruesome and extremely inhumane. Different medical schools and universities provided doctors and other research staff to help conduct these experiments, and they used both prisoners and civilians as the guinea pigs for them. There were a bunch of different experiments that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them with pathogens such as plague or cholera or anthrax. Others involved vivisection or operations with no anesthesia, putting them in a pressure chamber to see how much a human can withstand before bursting, or live weapons testing. It is hard to believe that this was a real thing that happened, and we honestly can't even begin to imagine what those people were forced to face during that time.